Honor saves families, but what happens when it destroys lives? Why Confucianism rarely speaks about suicide directly. Confucianism is often misunderstood as a religion, but it is more accurately a moral and social philosophy focused on harmony, order, and responsibility within human relationships. Unlike Buddhism or Christianity, Confucianism does not center its teachings on metaphysical salvation or the afterlife, and because of this, it rarely speaks directly about suicide as an isolated moral act. Instead, it frames life and death within a dense web of social obligations, family roles, and ethical duties. Suicide is not debated loudly in Confucian texts because it is absorbed into a larger question: what does a person owe to their parents, their ancestors, and the social order itself? This indirectness has led many to assume Confucianism is silent or permissive, but the truth is more complex and far more demanding. Life is a moral trust, not a personal possession. In Confucian thought, life is not owned by the individual in the modern sense. A person is understood as the continuation of their parents' lives, their ancestors' efforts, and their family line. This belief is crystallized in the principle of filial piety, shao, which places honoring one's parents at the core of moral existence. To damage or destroy one's own body is therefore not merely self-directed harm, it is harm done to one's parents and to the lineage that gave rise to that life. Suicide, within this framework, is not primarily judged as a personal tragedy, but as a rupture in relational continuity. This does not mean the individual disappears, but that individuality is never morally isolated from the family. The body belongs to the parents. One of the most frequently cited Confucian statements comes from the classic of filial piety: the body, hair, and skin are received from the parents, one must not damage them. This teaching is often misunderstood as rigid or archaic, but its moral logic is relational rather than authoritarian. The body is not sacred because it belongs to a god, but because it embodies gratitude and continuity. Suicide violates this principle by severing the bond of care that flows upward and downward through generations. It is seen as a rejection of indebtedness, not in a financial sense, but in an existential one. This belief creates a powerful ethical barrier against self-destruction, but it can also become a source of unbearable pressure. Honor, shame, and moral failure. Confucian societies have historically placed enormous emphasis on honor and moral reputation, not as personal branding, but as social glue. A person's actions reflect not only on themselves, but on their family and community. In this context, suicide has sometimes been framed paradoxically, condemned as unfilial in most cases, yet historically tolerated or even praised in extreme situations involving public disgrace or moral catastrophe. This tension is one of the least discussed truths about Confucianism. Suicide was never promoted as a solution, but under certain historical conditions, dying to preserve collective honor was seen as less damaging than living in shame. These cases were rare, contextual, and tightly bound to social codes, yet their existence complicates any simplistic claim that Confucianism uniformly forbids suicide. The dangerous legacy of honor-based ethics. While modern Confucian scholars emphasize that life should always be preserved, the historical memory of honor-based self-sacrifice has left a lasting imprint on East Asian cultures. The pressure to protect family reputation, avoid disgrace, or prevent burdening others has, in some cases, intensified suicidal ideation rather than prevented it. This is where Confucian ethics can become dangerous when stripped of compassion and flexibility. When duty is emphasized without emotional support, suffering becomes invisible. The philosophy that once aimed to preserve harmony can unintentionally silence pain, especially when failure is seen as moral weakness rather than human limitation. Confucius himself, what he did not say matters. Confucius spoke extensively about virtue, responsibility, and proper conduct, but he rarely addressed death directly. When he did, he emphasized life, ethical cultivation, and social duty rather than metaphysical speculation. His famous response, "If we do not yet know life, how can we know death?" is often cited to show that Confucianism prioritizes living well over theorizing about dying. This silence is not avoidance, it is focus. Suicide, from this perspective, is not a philosophical question to debate, but a failure of social and moral conditions that should have prevented despair from reaching that point. Individual suffering versus social order. A central tension in Confucianism lies between individual suffering and collective stability. The system is designed to reduce chaos and promote harmony, but it often assumes that individuals can endure hardship for the sake of the whole. When suffering becomes overwhelming, this expectation can turn into silent coercion. Suicide, in such cases, is not framed as rebellion, but as collapse under weight. Confucianism traditionally responds by reinforcing moral bonds rather than interrogating psychological pain, and this has both preserved communities and, at times, failed individuals. Compassion exists, but it is indirect. Contrary to popular belief, Confucianism is not devoid of compassion. The concept of humaneness, lies at the heart of its ethics. However, compassion is expressed through proper relationships and responsible action rather than emotional validation. This means that someone in despair may receive practical support without ever having their inner pain named. The intention is care, but the result can feel like neglect. Confucian compassion often assumes endurance, and this assumption becomes problematic when endurance is no longer possible. Why Confucianism still rejects suicide today. Modern Confucian thinkers overwhelmingly reject suicide as incompatible with filial duty, social responsibility, and human dignity. The emphasis has shifted away from honor-based exceptions toward preservation of life and care for mental suffering. Suicide is increasingly framed not as moral failure, but as a signal that relational systems have broken down. This represents a quiet evolution within Confucian ethics, one that acknowledges psychological reality without abandoning its relational core. The unspoken truth of Part 1. The truth rarely spoken is that Confucianism both protects and pressures life. Its rejection of suicide is rooted in gratitude, continuity, and responsibility, yet its silence around inner suffering can deepen isolation. Understanding Confucianism's view on suicide requires holding this contradiction without simplifying it. It is not a philosophy of death, but a philosophy that demands life be lived for others as well as oneself, and that demand can save lives or overwhelm them, depending on how it is applied. Mental suffering without a name. One of the most difficult aspects of Confucianism is that it developed long before modern psychology, and as a result, many forms of mental suffering were not named as illnesses but interpreted through moral or relational lenses. Sadness, despair, exhaustion, and even persistent hopelessness were often absorbed into the language of character, endurance, or improper balance within relationships. This does not mean Confucian thinkers denied suffering, but it does mean that suffering was rarely treated as an internal condition separate from social context. Where a person collapsed inwardly, the assumption was often that something in their duties, relationships, or self-cultivation had gone wrong, which could deepen shame rather than invite care. Silence as virtue, and as risk. Confucian ethics places high value on restraint of speech, emotional moderation, and social harmony. Speaking too openly about inner turmoil has historically been viewed as disruptive or self-indulgent, especially when it risks burdening others. Silence is often praised as maturity, but when suffering becomes severe, silence can turn into isolation. People learn to endure quietly, believing that voicing despair would dishonor their family or destabilize relationships. In this context, suicidal thoughts may remain completely invisible until it is too late, not because people do not care, but because care is expressed through order rather than expression. Duty as structure, and as pressure. Confucianism organizes life around roles: child, parent, spouse, official, elder. These roles provide structure, meaning, and identity, and for many people they are protective against despair. However, when someone feels they are failing these roles, the same structure becomes oppressive. The individual may conclude that their continued existence brings shame, disappointment, or burden to others. Suicide, in such distorted reasoning, is not chosen out of selfishness, but out of a misguided sense of responsibility. Confucianism never endorses this conclusion, yet its role-based ethics can unintentionally feed it when compassion is absent. The absence of moral absolutism about the mind. Unlike religious systems that frame suicide primarily as sin or transgression against divine command, Confucianism evaluates actions through their impact on relationships and social harmony. This means there is no single absolute statement about internal states like despair or depression. Responsibility is contextual, not mechanistic. While suicide is condemned as harmful to family and society, Confucian ethics allows for moral complexity in judging the person, even if the act is rejected. This subtlety is often overlooked, leading to caricatures of Confucianism as either brutally rigid or quietly permissive, when in fact it is neither. When endurance becomes moralized. Endurance is one of Confucianism's most admired traits. The capacity to persist through hardship for the sake of others is considered noble and mature. However, when endurance is moralized without limit, suffering becomes a test of worth rather than a signal of need. People may believe that breaking down is shameful, that asking for help is weakness, and that continuing silently is the only honorable option. This mindset does not cause suicide by itself, but it can remove the emotional exits that prevent despair from turning fatal. Confucian compassion is practical, not emotional. The Confucian concept of compassion, Ren, is often misunderstood by modern audiences. It does not prioritize emotional expression, verbal validation, or therapeutic dialogue. Instead, it focuses on concrete responsibility: feeding, sheltering, guiding, correcting. A person in distress may receive practical support while their inner pain remains unnamed and unacknowledged. This approach can stabilize lives, but it can also leave people feeling unseen. In cases of deep psychological suffering, practical care alone may not be enough to counter despair. Suicide is social failure, not individual evil. In modern Confucian scholarship, suicide is increasingly framed as a failure of social systems rather than individual morality. When someone reaches a point where death feels preferable to continued existence, something in the network of family, community, or institutional care has broken down. This perspective shifts attention away from blame and toward prevention, asking not only what the individual thought or felt, but what support was absent. This shift represents one of the most important, yet least publicized, evolutions in Confucian ethics today. Modern Confucian societies and the mental health crisis. In East Asian societies shaped by Confucian values, rapid modernization has intensified pressure without dissolving duty. Economic competition, academic expectations, and family responsibility converge, often leaving individuals with little space to fail safely. Suicide rates in these contexts have forced scholars and policymakers to re-examine traditional ethics. Increasingly, Confucian principles are being reinterpreted to justify mental health care, open dialogue, and shared responsibility, arguing that preserving life is the highest form of filial and social duty. The quiet ethical shift. A quiet shift is taking place within contemporary Confucian thought. Scholars emphasize that honoring parents includes caring for one's own mental health, that responsibility includes seeking help, and that social harmony cannot be built on silent suffering. Suicide is still rejected, but the reasons are reframed, not because failure is intolerable, but because life remains relationally valuable even when one feels broken. This reframing does not abandon tradition, it deepens it. The unspoken tension of Part 2. The unspoken tension at the heart of Confucianism is this: the same ethics that bind people together can also bind pain inside. Duty can protect, but it can also suffocate. Silence can preserve harmony, but it can also erase suffering. Understanding Confucianism's relationship to suicide requires seeing both sides without collapsing one into the other. The philosophy does not glorify death, but it demands a social world strong enough to hold those who are struggling to live. Hope without escape. Confucianism does not offer hope as escape from suffering, nor does it promise relief through transcendence or rebirth. Its version of hope is grounded, relational, and often quiet. Hope exists in the belief that relationships can be repaired, duties rebalanced, and dignity preserved even when life feels diminished. This kind of hope is not emotionally uplifting, it is stabilizing. It does not say that pain will end soon, but it insists that pain does not cancel one's place within the moral world. Suicide is rejected here not because suffering is denied, but because suffering is not allowed to erase relational worth. Reframing honor without self-destruction. One of the most important modern developments in Confucian thought is the reinterpretation of honor. Historically, honor was tied tightly to reputation, obedience, and public perception. Contemporary Confucian scholars argue that this interpretation was incomplete and dangerous. True honor, they claim, lies in preserving life, acknowledging limitation, and protecting relational continuity. To remain alive while imperfect is now increasingly framed as more honorable than dying to avoid shame. This shift does not erase history, but it corrects it, emphasizing that dignity is sustained through endurance with support, not disappearance. When duty must be redistributed. Confucian ethics has long emphasized personal duty, but modern interpretation recognizes that duty must sometimes be redistributed. When one person carries too much responsibility alone, moral systems fail. Families, institutions, and communities are increasingly called to share burdens rather than reinforce silent endurance. Suicide prevention, from this perspective, is not achieved by reminding individuals of their obligations, but by asking whether obligations have become unlivable. This reframing shifts moral attention outward, toward structures rather than solely toward character. The role of the family after crisis. In Confucian-influenced cultures, the family remains the primary moral unit. After a suicidal crisis, the family is not expected to enforce discipline or shame, but to restore stability, presence, and continuity. Modern Confucian thinkers stress that criticism, blame, or emotional withdrawal deepen harm. Care is expressed through consistency, shared routine, and protection of dignity. While emotional language may remain limited, the intention is reintegration rather than exclusion, signaling that belonging is not conditional on strength. When death has already occurred. Confucianism does not elaborate detailed doctrines about the fate of the soul, but it offers clear guidance for the living after death. Rituals emphasize respect, remembrance, and responsibility to those who remain. Suicide is mourned as a rupture in relational continuity, not as a moral contamination. Families are encouraged to honor the person's life without idealizing the death, and to focus on restoring harmony rather than assigning blame. The ethical priority is repair, not explanation. Confucianism and modern mental health. One of the most significant yet underreported shifts is Confucianism's engagement with modern psychology. Increasingly, scholars argue that caring for mental health is a filial act, because preserving one's life honors parents and ancestors. Seeking help is reframed as responsibility, not weakness. This integration allows Confucian ethics to retain its relational core while acknowledging scientific understanding of the mind. Suicide remains rejected, but the path away from it becomes more humane and realistic. The community's ethical obligation. Confucianism has always emphasized social responsibility, but its application to suicide prevention is now becoming explicit. Schools, workplaces, and local institutions are increasingly seen as moral actors, responsible for creating conditions where failure does not equal disgrace. Ethical governance includes protecting psychological well-being, reducing humiliation, and offering second chances. In this sense, suicide prevention becomes a measure of moral maturity within a society, not merely an individual concern. What Confucianism refuses to say. Confucianism refuses to say that life belongs solely to the individual, and it refuses to say that suffering automatically grants moral permission to die. These refusals are often criticized as restrictive, but they are rooted in the belief that individuals are never morally isolated. At the same time, Confucianism increasingly refuses to say that endurance must be silent or solitary. This dual refusal defines its modern ethical position: life must be preserved, and suffering must be addressed collectively. The quiet strength of staying. In Confucian ethics, there is no dramatic language about heroism and survival, but there is deep respect for those who continue despite imperfection. Staying alive, continuing to participate in relationships, and allowing others to help are increasingly understood as acts of moral courage. This perspective shifts the narrative away from spectacular sacrifice toward quiet persistence. Suicide, in contrast, is seen not as release, but as the loss of future relational possibility. The truth rarely spoken. The truth rarely spoken is that Confucianism both restrains and redeems. It restrains by binding individuals to others, limiting radical autonomy, and rejecting self-erasure. It redeems by insisting that no one exists alone, that worth is relational, and that failure does not dissolve belonging. Suicide is rejected not because life must be perfect, but because life remains ethically meaningful even when broken. Confucianism's final answer is not condemnation, but responsibility shared across generations, families, and communities.